Anxious attachment is often misunderstood, mislabeled, and minimized. People who experience it are frequently told they're too clingy, too emotional, or too needy. But that narrative misses the truth entirely. Anxious attachment doesn't come from weakness. It comes from a history of unmet emotional needs. It's not that you're incapable of love or stability. It's that you've been conditioned to expect that love is inconsistent, and that safety is something you have to earn rather than something that's freely given. When you grow up or enter relationships where affection is unpredictable, where attention is given in bursts, or where connection is withdrawn as punishment, you start to believe that you have to perform to keep love. You become hyper-attuned to changes in tone, response time, or body language. Where you read between the lines constantly. Your nervous system is on high alert because inconsistency has trained you to be that way. You start interpreting silence as danger, distance as rejection, and lack of reassurance as abandonment. This doesn't mean you're fragile. It means you learned to adapt. Anxious attachment is your emotional system working overtime. It's a survival response. It's your heart trying to protect itself from what it has learned to fear the most: disconnection. And ironically, the more someone matters to you, the more that fear kicks in. It's not because you're weak. It's because you care, you feel deeply, you invest heavily. You want closeness so badly that the threat of losing it feels unbearable. That depth of emotion isn't a flaw, it's evidence of how much you value intimacy. But when we don't understand this, we start to judge ourselves for being too much. We shame ourselves for how often we worry, how quickly we text back, how hard we try to interpret vague signals. We think something's wrong with us when someone pulls away, and we question our entire worth when someone doesn't reciprocate. Here's what you need to hear. The anxiety isn't the problem. It's the story you've attached to it. The belief that you're broken, that you're hard to love, or that you're just not enough unless you're constantly earning someone's affection. That's the real damage. And that belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from people or patterns that made you feel replaceable, invisible, or only valuable when you were being convenient. So no, anxious attachment isn't weakness. It's not emotional incompetence. It's an intelligent system doing its best to protect you from further pain. It's your past echoing into your present, trying to make sure you're never blindsided again. But that system, as well-meaning as it is, needs an update. Because real safety doesn't come from clinging harder. It comes from realizing that your value doesn't rise or fall based on someone else's consistency. Healing begins the moment you stop pathologizing your needs and start honoring them instead. Anxious attachment is not a lack of control. It's a repeated pattern of emotional overextension. It's what happens when love becomes an effort rather than an experience. People with anxious attachment don't sit back and hope for connection. They stretch themselves, emotionally, mentally, sometimes even physically, just to feel close, seen, and safe. They give more than they have. They check in when they need checking on. They compromise when no one's asking them to, just to keep peace. And all of this comes from a deep, often subconscious fear that if they don't overgive, they will be overlooked. This overextension shows up subtly. You initiate every conversation because you're afraid silence means disinterest. You make excuses for someone's inconsistency because you'd rather protect the illusion of connection than confront the reality of distance. You suppress your needs because expressing them might scare them away. You walk on emotional eggshells, not because you're fragile, but because you're trying to preserve a relationship you value, even at the cost of yourself. But here's the truth. This overextension is not a reflection of your worth. It's a defense mechanism. Somewhere along the way, you internalized the idea that love is not something you receive just for being. You believed it's something you have to earn through effort, through understanding, through being available at all times, through being a low maintenance, even when your needs are screaming to be met. This pattern isn't weakness. It's emotional self-sacrifice dressed as care. The irony is that people with anxious attachment are often incredibly generous, emotionally intelligent, and deeply empathetic. They pick up on subtle changes in mood. They sense distance before words are even spoken. They show up, they give, they feel. But without boundaries, this turns into emotional over-functioning. Instead of being met halfway, they find themselves doing all the work, carrying both the relationship and the anxiety it causes. And this can be exhausting. Because no matter how much you give, it never quite feels like enough. You're constantly chasing reassurance, but it's like pouring water into a cup with a hole at the bottom. What you truly want is stability, safety, to feel chosen without having to audition. But instead, your overextension tells you, maybe if I give a little more, they'll finally stay. The problem isn't in your ability to love, it's in the way you believe you have to prove it. Overextension isn't noble, it's not romantic, it's a silent erosion of your emotional well-being. And healing begins when you realize that the right connection won't require that kind of contortion. You shouldn't have to twist yourself into someone else's emotional availability. You shouldn't have to do backflips just to hold someone's attention. Real love doesn't require overextension. It only asks for truth, presence, and mutual care. What? And the moment you stop trying to earn it is the moment you start experiencing it. People with anxious attachment are often some of the most emotionally intelligent individuals you'll ever meet. They notice everything, your tone, your energy, the way you pause before responding, the slight change in your text patterns. They pick up on the nuances others miss because their emotional radar is always on. They're scanning for safety, for signs of closeness or disconnection. But what's often misunderstood is that this high sensitivity doesn't make them irrational. It makes them deeply attuned. This emotional intelligence, however, doesn't come from nowhere. It's developed, usually over years, as a response to unpredictability. When love or attention in early relationships was inconsistent or conditional, they learned to read the room before stepping into it. They learned to sense mood shifts before anyone said a word. It was a way to survive emotionally, to avoid conflict, to gain approval, to secure some sense of control over relationships that often felt anything but stable. But emotional intelligence without regulation becomes hypervigilance. The anxious mind begins to see threat in neutrality. A delayed response becomes rejection. A short answer becomes anger. Silence becomes punishment. This creates a state of near constant anxiety. Not because the person is dramatic or unstable, but because their system has been trained to stay alert, to anticipate disconnection before it happens. And while this can lead to emotional exhaustion, it also reflects a profound capacity, the ability to empathize, to connect deeply, to love with intensity and awareness. Anxiously attached individuals often make incredible friends, partners, and communicators because they care. They want to understand, they want to make things right. But when that caring becomes over-functioning, when they start managing the emotions of others at the expense of their own, they cross a line from emotional intelligence into emotional self-abandonment. This hyper-awareness can feel like a superpower and a curse. On one hand, it helps them form meaningful connections. On the other, it causes them to overanalyze everything. Every pause, every message, every unmet expectation. They become stuck in a loop of needing constant reassurance, not because they're weak, but because they're wired to expect disconnection and are desperate to prevent it. What they really need isn't to shut down their emotional intelligence. It's to pair it with discernment and self-trust, to learn that just because they sense something doesn't mean it's true, that not every pause is a problem, that someone else's emotional distance isn't necessarily their fault. When they begin to regulate their responses, they reclaim the gift that anxious attachment has given them, the ability to love consciously, to feel deeply, and to connect meaningfully, but without losing themselves in the process. The goal isn't to stop being emotionally aware. It's to stop believing that every emotional shift requires a response, an apology, or a solution. It's to realize that sometimes being emotionally intelligent means knowing when to feel for yourself, not just everyone else. You're not too much. You're not too much to the wrong dynamic. That sentence is a turning point for anyone who's ever struggled with anxious attachment. Because when you're in a relationship or any connection, that doesn't meet your emotional energy with the same level of care and effort. It's easy to start internalizing the imbalance as a personal flaw. You start to believe that you're the problem, that your emotions are overwhelming, that your needs are excessive. But the issue isn't that you're too much. The issue is that you're constantly pouring into someone who isn't pouring back. When you give and give, your time, your energy, your vulnerability, into a relationship where there's no reciprocity, you eventually begin to feel like a burden. That's what anxious attachment does. It tricks you into thinking that your efforts to connect are desperate rather than genuine. That your desire for clarity is clinginess. That your emotional investment is something to hide or shrink. But all of those qualities Your desire to connect, to understand, to deepen the relationship are not weaknesses. They are strengths misapplied to the wrong context. The wrong dynamic isn't always obvious. It might not look like someone who outright mistreats you. Often it's subtle. It's someone who responds inconsistently, someone who gives just enough to keep you hoping, but never enough to feel safe. It's the person who says they care but disappears when you express vulnerability. These dynamics are confusing, and confusion is the perfect breeding ground for anxious attachment. It creates an endless loop of trying harder, being more available, less demanding, more chill, all in the hope that one day your efforts will finally be enough. But you can't become more lovable to someone who doesn't know how to love. You can only become more exhausted. And when you're tired, emotionally depleted, and second-guessing yourself constantly, you start to believe you are too much, when in reality, you're just misaligned. The relationship doesn't reflect your worth. It reflects what happens when your care is poured into someone who isn't capable of receiving or returning it in the way you need. The transformation begins when you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "Is this the right place for my love?" You start to realize that you don't need to shrink yourself to be accepted. You need to realign with people who see your depth not as a threat, but as a gift. People who meet you with curiosity, not avoidance. Who make you feel safe, not confused. Who welcome your full emotional self, instead of making you feel like you have to edit it. You are not too much. You are simply in need of people who can hold what you bring without making you feel like you need to apologize for it. The moment you stop overgiving to the wrong dynamic, you create space for the right ones to enter, ones that remind you that your capacity to love deeply is your power, not your problem, your instincts to connect, to care, to love deeply. Those are not flaws. They are some of the most beautiful parts of who you are. The desire to be close, to feel seen, to emotionally bond with someone isn't something to be ashamed of. But what often happens with anxious attachment is that these beautiful instincts become untamed. They run ahead of you. They lead the way, even when the person in front of you hasn't earned that access. And without boundaries, those instincts stop serving your peace and start sabotaging it. Wanting connection is healthy, but constantly abandoning yourself to maintain that connection is not. There's a difference between being open and being emotionally overexposed. When you don't have boundaries around your emotional availability, you start giving parts of yourself to people who haven't proven they can care for them. Phodium. You begin to share too early, stay too long, or overinvest in people who show inconsistency. And each time, you lose a little more of your center. Your instincts are trying to bring you close to others. That's natural. But when closeness becomes a goal you chase at the expense of your own stability, you're no longer being led by love. You're being led by fear. Fear of abandonment. Fear of being overlooked. Fear that if you don't act quickly enough or give enough, you'll be forgotten. That fear is valid. But you don't need to let it drive the car. This is where boundaries come in, not as walls to keep people out, but as filters to protect what's sacred within you. Boundaries allow your instincts to function with wisdom. They allow you to pause and ask, has this person earned the level of access I'm giving them? They allow you to stay connected to yourself while choosing whether or not someone is healthy to connect with. And often that inconsistency is mistaken for chemistry. When someone pulls away and then comes closer, it mimics the emotional roller coaster of past experiences, and it feels addictive. But healing teaches you to pause in those moments and ask, is this intensity? Or is this insecurity being triggered? When you become discerning, you don't stop wanting connection. You just stop confusing availability with affection. You stop interpreting mixed signals as a challenge to win over and instead see them as a red flag. You begin to look past the highs and lows and ask, does this person create peace in my life or anxiety? Because love isn't supposed to feel like a guessing game. It's not supposed to keep you up at night, questioning your worth or wondering if you're enough. Discernment teaches you to choose, not just to be chosen. It reminds you that you are not powerless in relationships, that you don't have to accept whatever comes your way out of fear of being alone. You learn to take your time, to watch patterns, not just words. To trust your gut when something feels off, instead of overriding it in hopes of getting back to the good moments. It gives you the strength to walk away when the connection costs your peace, even if your emotions are deeply involved. This kind of growth is quiet. It doesn't scream, "I don't care." It whispers, "I've learned to care wisely." It means you can still feel the pull of attachment, but now you can slow it down. You can sit with discomfort without needing to act immediately. You can hold space for your own emotions without handing someone else the responsibility of fixing them. Healing doesn't make you less emotional. It helps you become more emotionally responsible. It means your empathy now includes yourself. Your loyalty now includes your own well-being. And your love, as big and generous as it still is no longer given blindly. It's given with presence, patience, and power. You're not becoming less of a lover, you're becoming more of a chooser. And that shift from chasing to choosing, from reacting to responding, is what turns anxious attachment into anchored connection. Not by losing your heart, but by finally learning how to protect it. Being anxiously attached often feels like an emotional roller coaster. Constant highs and lows, brief moments of closeness followed by long stretches of doubt, overthinking, and worry. But beneath the surface, what's actually happening is a repeated disconnection from yourself. You become so consumed by what the other person is thinking, feeling, or doing that you lose touch with your own emotional center. You stop asking, "How do I feel in this relationship?" and start obsessing over, "How do they feel about me?" When you're anxiously attached, your focus is external. You measure your worth based on someone else's behavior. You feel okay if they're responsive, but unravel the moment they're distant. Your emotional state becomes tied to their availability, their reassurance, their attention. And in doing that, you slowly abandon your own internal compass. But your healing doesn't begin with trying to control the other person's actions. It begins with reconnecting to you. It begins with learning how to be present with your emotions without outsourcing them to someone else. When you feel that familiar anxiety rising, the dread that they're pulling away, the urge to send a message just to feel close again, that's your cue, not to reach out to them, but to reach inward. What am I feeling? What do I need? Where have I stopped being present with myself? The truth is, anxious attachment thrives in the absence of self-connection. When you are grounded in your sense of worth, you don't panic at every shift in someone else's behavior. You can recognize their withdrawal as their pattern, not a reflection of your inadequacy. But to get there, you have to build a relationship with yourself that is strong enough to hold you through moments of uncertainty. That's what self-connection does. It stabilizes you. It reminds you that your needs are valid whether or not someone else is meeting them. It helps you respond instead of react. You stop chasing people who make you feel unsure and start nurturing the part of you that's always been waiting to be chosen by you. Because in truth, anxious attachment isn't just about fearing abandonment. It's about feeling disconnected from your own sense of emotional safety. When you reconnect with yourself, everything shifts. You begin to see that your value doesn't depend on being chosen, validated, or loved by someone else. You start to anchor your identity not in how someone sees you, but in how you see yourself. And from that place, your relationships transform. You stop overgiving just to keep someone close. You stop tolerating inconsistency just to avoid being alone. You show up with boundaries, clarity, and a calm sense of power that says, "I choose me first." This isn't about isolation. It's about integration. It's about integration. When you return to yourself, you bring your full presence into your relationships. And from there, you no longer relate from fear. You relate from wholeness. When you're caught in anxious attachment, one of the biggest challenges is learning how to trust again, not just trust others, but trust yourself. Trust becomes a complicated dance because your past experiences have taught you that people who are supposed to love you might disappear, pull away, or not be fully there when you need them most. That history creates a deep-seated fear that any closeness could be temporary, unreliable, or fragile. You naturally attract people who match your energy, who respect your boundaries, and who show up consistently, not perfectly, but reliably. Ultimately, trust is the foundation of any secure connection. It's not about ignoring risks or pretending everything will always be fine. It's about having faith in your ability to navigate the challenges and still maintain your sense of self-worth. When you build that internal trust, anxious attachment loses its grip and you open the door to love that feels safe, steady, and real. Learning to set emotional boundaries is one of the most important and often most difficult steps in healing anxious attachment. When you have an anxious attachment style, boundaries might feel foreign or even threatening. You might associate them with rejection or abandonment, or worry that setting limits will push people away. But the truth is, boundaries are not walls designed to isolate you. They are bridges that help protect your emotional well-being and create healthier, more balanced relationships. Anxious attachment often comes with a pattern of overgiving and emotional overextension, where you put the needs and feelings of others ahead of your own, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. This happens because you're trying so hard to secure love, approval, and connection that you forget to check in with yourself. You forget to ask, what do I need? Or is this healthy for me? Boundaries remind you to ask those questions. They create the space necessary for self-care and self-respect. Setting boundaries means learning to say no without guilt, to express your needs clearly, and to walk away from interactions or relationships that drain you emotionally. It means recognizing your limits and honoring them, even if others don't understand at first. This can be scary because anxious attachment often includes a deep fear of rejection, and setting boundaries feels risky. But it's a risk worth taking because boundaries are the foundation of self-love. When you start setting boundaries, you send a powerful message to yourself and to others that your feelings matter, that your emotional health is a priority. And when you prioritize yourself in this way, you begin to attract relationships that reflect that respect. People who honor your limits, who don't take advantage of your generosity, and who engage with you in a way that feels reciprocal. Boundaries also help break the cycle of anxiety that comes from overextending yourself. Instead of trying to manage other people's emotions or fix their problems, you learn to focus on your own emotional landscape. You create clarity around what you will accept and what you won't. This clarity reduces confusion and helps you avoid the exhausting pull dynamics that anxious attachment often gets caught in. Importantly, boundaries are flexible, not rigid. They are not about shutting people out, but about creating healthy spaces where connection can happen authentically and safely. They teach you that it's possible to be close to someone without losing yourself. That love doesn't have to come at the cost of your peace. As you practice setting boundaries, you may notice your anxiety lessen because you are no longer constantly overgiving or overanalyzing to try to keep people close. You start to feel more grounded and centered, even in moments of uncertainty. And that groundedness is exactly what anxious attachment needs to transform into secure attachment. In the end, boundaries are an act of courage and self-respect. They protect your heart, honor your needs, and pave the way for relationships where you can be your whole self, seen, valued, and safe. One of the most liberating realizations for someone with anxious attachment is understanding that self-love and emotional regulation are not selfish acts. They are essential foundations for healthy relationships. 4. Too often, when you have anxious attachment, the focus is so heavily on affixing the relationship or winning the other person's affection that you neglect the relationship with yourself. You may feel guilty for prioritizing your own needs, or think that being self-loving means being self-centered. But nothing could be further from the truth. Self-love is the act of valuing your own worth, setting standards for how you want to be treated, and committing to your well-being. It's about recognizing that you deserve kindness, respect, and patience, not just from others, but from yourself. Emotional regulation is the skill of managing your emotional responses, so you don't get swept away by anxiety, fear, or insecurity. It means giving yourself permission to feel deeply, but also to pause, breathe, and respond with clarity rather than reaction. When you practice self-love and emotional regulation, you break the cycle of anxious attachment, where your emotions are tightly linked to the behavior of others. Instead of spiraling into panic when someone doesn't text back right away, you learn to soothe yourself, remind yourself of your value, and hold space for your feelings without letting them control your actions. This creates an internal sense of security that no external situation can easily shake. Developing these skills doesn't happen overnight, and it often requires intentional effort. It might mean daily affirmations, mindfulness practices, or therapy. It could involve journaling to identify triggers and patterns, or learning techniques like deep breathing or grounding exercises to manage moments of overwhelm. The key is consistency and compassion, treating yourself like you would a close friend who is struggling. Self-love also means becoming your own biggest advocate. It means refusing to settle for relationships that are one-sided or hurtful. It means walking away from dynamics that trigger your anxious attachment, rather than trying to force connection where there isn't mutual respect. When you love yourself, you set boundaries naturally because you know what you deserve. This internal work transforms how you show up in relationships. Instead of clinging out of fear, you connect from a place of confidence. Instead of over-explaining or apologizing for your feelings, you express yourself with honesty and calm. Instead of feeling lost in someone else's reactions, you remain grounded in your own truth. Ultimately, self-love and emotional regulation are not just tools for surviving anxious attachment. They are the keys to thriving beyond it. They empower you to build connections based on mutual respect, trust, and genuine care. They remind you that your worth isn't defined by anyone else's attention, but by the love you cultivate within yourself. And that realization changes everything. To wrap this up, remember that anxious attachment isn't a sign of weakness or something broken inside you. It's a sign that you've been overextending your emotional energy in ways that no longer serve you. It's a pattern rooted in deep human needs for connection and safety, but one that can leave you feeling depleted, uncertain, and anxious. The real power lies in recognizing this pattern and choosing a different way forward. One where you honor your instincts to love while learning to set boundaries, build self-trust, and reconnect with yourself first. Healing from anxious attachment is not about shutting down your emotions or giving up on meaningful relationships. It's about developing emotional wisdom, knowing when to give and when to protect, when to pursue connection and when to stand firm in your worth. It's about shifting from chasing external validation to cultivating internal security. When you do this, you don't just change your relationships, you transform how you relate to yourself. So if you find yourself anxious, wondering if you're too much or not enough, remind yourself this: you are not too much. You are simply ready to give your love and attention to the right places. You are capable of creating the kind of connection that feels safe, steady, and deeply fulfilling. And that journey begins by choosing yourself, honoring your emotions, and trusting that you are worthy of love exactly as you are. That is not just healing, that is empowerment. And that is your path forward.